Hi, everybody. Sorry I can't be in class today, but in lieu of our class meeting, this video lecture on Ernest Hemingway and John Steinbeck will serve. And also, I will post a discussion board assignment along with these two lectures to supplement for our class meeting. So, getting started. Hemingway's compelling inspiration was war, both as personal and symbolic experience and as a continuing condition of humankind. What I have here, by the way, is just my own textbook with my own underlines, annotations. So I'll be reading a lot of these things that I've already underlined. You can follow along there, as you can see. So war, our story that we read, Big Two-Hearted River, is not too much about war, right? It's just about Nick Adams as a guy who gets into the woods and goes for a hike and sets up camp, goes trout fishing, catches a few trout, cleans them, and presumably eats them. So not too much about war, except that it kind of is, and we'll talk more about that when we talk about the story. As adventurer, hunter, journalist, he sometimes seemed to resemble one of his own created characters when in 1952 he got it again. The Way It Was, The Old Man and the Sea, a nearly flawless short novel. There's our authors again, just kind of being ridiculous about genius and greatness. Flawless, how could a short story be flawless? I'm not really sure. Or novella, really. The Old Man and the Sea. Is really great novel by Hemingway about a old man who goes out and hooks a marlin bigger than his boat and fights it for days and finally gets it to shore, but the sharks have eaten most of it, and I believe the old man dies in the end. And death is often a part of Hemingway's stories as well, although we don't see it in our chosen story, the Big Two-Hearted River. He was awarded the Pulitzer Prize in 1953 and the Nobel Prize 54 with a promptness that suggested an overdue recognition. So again, our authors talking about how someone is before their time. Hunting and fishing, next page, in the Michigan North Woods. He grew up hunting and fishing in the Michigan North Woods, the Upper Peninsula as it's sometimes called. Let's see here. The author's naturalistic, okay, so Hemingway's naturalistic interpretation of fate was consistent. Well, let's see. So this again has to do with determinism, obviously in the realism that we're all going to die, and of course death again becoming his part of his tendency in literature. All causes in Hemingway are tragic. All causes in Hemingway's tragic vision are already lost. All the causes are lost. Everything is a lost cause because that is nature and the way things are. But the losers need not be lost. So if all causes are lost, but the people who are losing are not lost, right? It allows us to read Hemingway's characters as benefiting, through their loss, right? What distinguishes human beings and gives them salvation is their faithfulness to the ordeal, right? Which not so much in Big Two-Hearted River, but in his other characters, and some in Nick Adams and the Big Two-Hearted River. He's definitely faithful to the ordeal, and it's his interrogation with the swamp is what I was getting at earlier, symbolic of war. Faithfulness in the ordeal, which all are called on to face, and if by some dirty trick one dies anyway, we owe God a death. is part of his philosophy. We owe God a death, but we can keep the rendezvous with courage. And so, faithfulness in the ordeal, no matter how difficult, no matter um, how natural and the forces of nature are on us, being faithful to that, right? His characters often resemble this. Um, like Stephen Crane, whom he admired as a pioneer of naturalist war novel. Remember, Stephen Crane wrote The Red Badge of Courage. Hemingway embraced the cult of experience. You remember also Ambrose Bierce, who said to write was from experience, not from reading. Crane's thirst for life was fatal, and Hemingway's nearly as compelling. And so, at the end of the bio, we see you could only write what you truly felt, and never when there is no water in the well. And so, this is Hemingway's belief. So, he had to go experience life, and if he was not experiencing anything exciting, then there was nothing to write about. Of the bullfight, he remarked, I was trying to learn to write commencing with the simplest things, and one of the simplest things and the most fundamental is violent death. Death became, in his fiction, the extreme limit of experience and the final test of the genuine ordeal. And so while Nick Adams is out trout fishing and the swamp kind of looms, the swamp may be a symbol of that kind of looming death. It also may be this looming war that I mentioned earlier. Death appears in his writing as in violent forms, or understated as bad luck, or symbolically projected as mutilation or sterility in Jake Barnes, Nick Adams, and the protagonists, the two have not, and Across the River, his weakest novels. Hemingway left his Cuban estate in November 1960 for a new last home in a remote spot near Ketchum, Idaho. During the next 8 months, he suffered 2 long illnesses requiring hospitalization. In the early morning of July 2nd, standing beside, and this is how our authors tell us that he's committed suicide, with a shotgun. It's in very kind of coded euphemistic terms to soften the information for us. Standing beside his beloved gun rack in his own home, he died of head wounds resulting from the discharge of his favorite shotgun in his own hands. And so, I don't know, the way they put it seems almost ambiguous, but in fact, he killed himself with his shotgun. Before we get on to the story, I do want to mention that In Our Time is the collection of short stories that Hemingway published, in which is our Big Two-Hearted River story. However, you notice that the Big Two-Hearted River is in 2 parts. And so there's part 1 and part 2, and published in the book, In Our Time, between each story is something else, not part of the story. And between Big Two-Hearted River Part 1 and Big Two-Hearted River Part 2 appears this chapter. They hanged Sam Cardinella at 6 o'clock in the morning in the corridor in the county jail. The corridor was high and narrow, tried, and so on and so forth. It's just a description of a hanging. While they were strapping his legs together, 2 guards held him up, and 2 priests were whispering to him. Be a man, my son, said one priest. When they came toward him with a cap to go over his head, Sam Cardinella lost control of his sphincter muscle. The guards who had been holding him both dropped him. They were both disgusted. How about a chair, Will? Asked one of the guards. Better get one, said a man nearby, a derby hat. So, it's strange, interesting. I'm not sure. The collection is called In Our Time, and so between each fictional story is a description of something seemingly more real, and a snapshot of some moment in our time. So perhaps that's the significance of these little chapters between the stories. Now getting on to the story, Big Two-Hearted River. Nick Adams. He appears to be a war veteran from the other stories in the collection, and in our time, Nick Adams appears in those stories as well, and he is in fact a war veteran. And he seems to have a lot of experience and training in the military. In his rucksack and his gear, he throws it out of the train. He sees a kingfisher, which is a bird, a big bird that's going to be eating fish out of the river. Um, they're in the style of Hemingway. We have these very simple sentences. They were very satisfactory. I wonder why his style is so very simple. He was happy. He felt all the old feelings. Very simple, stylistic, but the descriptions from Hemingway make us really see and feel what's going on, even though the sentences are so kind of flat. Um, let's see. Seney, Michigan was this country that he was dropped off in, and it was burned. From the time he had gotten down off the train and the baggage man had thrown his pack out of the open car door, things had been different. Seney was burned. The country was burned over and changed, but it did not matter. It could not all be burned, and so he's going to search for that place that's not burned. And we're curious as to why this land is burned. Perhaps it was a controlled burn of the landscape, or perhaps there was some kind of trauma there. I think the city is all burned up as well. So it seems like maybe there's something more going on there. Um, Nick is walking, he's hiking into the woods, and he sees these grasshoppers, right? And they're clinging to his socks, and they're all black. And Nick had wondered about them as he walked without really thinking about them. How do you wonder about something without thinking about it is maybe interesting there. Um, Now, as he watched the black hopper that was nibbling at the wool of his sock, oh, he stopped to have a cigarette here, I believe, right? With its four-way lip, he notes the attention to the four-way lip as a kind of a nod at Darwinism, which is what I'm getting at here, an attention to the detail of a creature. He realized that they had all turned black from living in the burned over land. He realized that the fire must have come the year before, but the grasshoppers were all black now. He wondered how long they would stay that way. And so I mentioned Darwin up here in my notes because many of the explanations about natural selection have to do with the color of a creature. There's one about moths where um, before a, before a city is built, all these moths in the I don't know, field in the meadow or whatever are white, except some of the genetic material of the moth makes some of the moths gray or darker. And the gray or darker moths would stand out on the flowers in the field and so on, and the birds would pick off the ones that stood out, the gray and dark ones. But once the city was built nearby, that same moth species, um, now the gray or darker ones could land on the buildings, and the white ones that landed on the buildings stood out against the side of the building, and so the population went from white to gray or darker colored because the landscape kind of changed. And the same thing is going on here as a natural selection example, where when the land burns over and the land becomes kind of black, if there's a genetically variant in the grasshoppers that is black, those are going to blend in now and survive more often, and therefore the genetic material will tend towards the black ones, and the brown or the green grasshoppers will stand out against the black landscape. And so he's nodding to this kind of natural selection, which is again another effect of Darwinism. So he walks, Nick Adams. He's hiking, and he sees the fish rising to insects coming from the swamp, the other side of the stream, when the sun went down. The trout jumped out of the water to take them. This is how trout feed. They rise up and take the bug off the surface. While Nick walked through the little stretch of meadow alongside the stream, trout had jumped high out of the water. Now as he looked down the river, the insects must be settling on the surface, for the trout were feeding steadily all down the stream, and he knew this is where he wanted to be. However, the ground rose wooded and sandy to overlook the meadow, the stretch of river, and the swamp, right? So remember the swamp in the end of the story. Sorry about the text there. Already, this is what he's making camp here. Already there was something mysterious and homelike. Nick was happy as he crawled inside his tent. He had not been unhappy all day. This was different, though. Now things were done. There had been this to do. Now it was done. It had been a hard trip. He was very tired. That was done. And so this language here, I don't know. How do you feel about how all these things were done? How do you feel about Nick Adams' character as someone who needs to get things done and feels fine now that things are done, and how tired he might have been after eating what is canned spaghetti or whatever he ate here? He was there in the good place. He was in his home where he had made it. Now he was hungry. He came out crawling. Oh, so now he's going to eat his dinner. It was quite dark outside. He was lighter in the tent. So I don't know. You get a little bit about Nick Adams' character here, with the language about what was done, and I think that this has something to do with his character as a war veteran, as someone who has endured this kind of trauma and now prefers things a certain way, and prefers a kind of solitude. And he's eating his canned goods, his canned food. Usually in a backpack you bring like dry food and stuff, but he's got his canned food. I've got the right to eat this kind of stuff if I'm willing to carry it, right? It's heavy. Nick said. His voice sounded strange in the darkening woods. Imagine just talking to yourself, right, when no one's there, and you hadn't spoken for a long time. You finally speak, and you break your own silence with your own voice. He did not speak again. See that? He started a fire with some chunks of pine wood, axe from a stump. Over the fire stuck a wire grill. Nick put the frying pan on it. There's a good smell. He was not going to spoil it all. Oh, so this is the part where his food's very hot and he doesn't want to burn his mouth. He doesn't want to spoil it, right? So he's this kind of meticulously thinking person. He was very hungry. Across the river in the swamp, again in the swamp, in the almost dark, he saw a mist rising. He looked at the tent once more. All right, he took full spoonful from the plate, right? He waited till he could have a full spoonful. The discipline that he uses to eat. He would not remember which way he made coffee. He could remember an argument about it with Hopkins. So Hopkins is a friend who may have died in the war. And so thinking about him, this remembrance when he's making coffee, is this sentimental moment with him. And he ends this, he goes to camp, he goes to bed without having fished. Nick drank the coffee, according to Hopkins, the coffee was better. Nick laughed. It made a good ending to the story. And then the next paragraph, out through the front of the tent, he watched the glow of the fire when night wind blew on it. It was a quiet night. The swamp was perfectly quiet. And so finally we get to part two. Remember, between these two parts would have been that description of a hanging. Um, and here we start with a kind of like foreshadowing of the swamp. We have some brown trout. No, brown. Nick put about 50 of the medium browns, the grasshoppers, into a bottle. They flew when they hopped. At first, they made one flight and stayed stiff when they landed, as though they were dead. I'm not sure what significance that is, but describing these hoppers as doing that, I thought was interesting. Also note that he turns over this log like he's getting his bait from outdoors, right? He doesn't go to a bait shop and buy some, obviously, and he doesn't bring some with him in the backpacking trip. He's sort of just using what's there, what's in nature. He made these sandwiches prior. In the pack, he found a big onion. He sliced it into two and peeled these silky outer layer. Then he cut one half into slices and made onion sandwiches. And he wrapped them. So he's brought the onions and bread. He makes these sandwiches before he heads to the river. And then we get him putting a cricket on the hook, spitting tobacco juice on it. I don't know if you've ever seen a cricket on a hook, but he kind of grabbed the hook and spits this stuff on it. He's stripping off line and he's fly fishing, right? He's letting this cricket float down stream. He hooks one. He's all right, Nick thought. He was only tired. He had wet his hand before he touched the trout. This is Keep 'em Wet is a website about fishing and about how you're supposed to do this thing that he explains. So he had not disturb the delicate mucus that covered him. If a trout was touched with a dry hand, a white fungus attacked the unprotected spot. Years before, when he had fished crowded streams with fly fish, he likes to be alone, right? He doesn't like these crowded streams. With fly fishermen ahead of him and behind him, Nick had again and again come on dead trout furry with this white fungus because these other fishermen didn't know how to handle the fish with a wet hand. They would always touch it with a dry hand. Drifted amongst the rocks or floating belly up in the pool. Nick did not like to fish with other men on the river unless he were of your party. They spoiled it. So he's very nitpicky about the way he fishes and who he fishes with and so on. Spinning for good luck. A fish that got away, one that was very big, right, gets away. Then he, by God, he was the biggest one I ever saw. So we're not really sure if this is the narrator or Nick, right? It's not a quote, so it might be interesting to look closer at that and make an argument about the narrator. Nick climbed out into the meadow and stood, water running down his trousers and out of his shoes. His shoes squelchy. He went over and sat on the logs. He did not want to rush his sensations any. And so he catches a couple more fish. There's a river stream called the Black. All right, so here's the end of the story, right, where the swamp becomes a kind of some kind of looming. Oh, I missed the part where he dipped his onion sandwiches in and he ate. But he dips his onion sandwiches in the water. I believe that's an exam question. Or what kind of or sandwiches did he make? It was an onion sandwich. Took the sandwiches out, there they are, of his pocket. He dipped the sandwiches in the cold water. The current carried away the crumbs. He ate the sandwiches and dipped his hat full of water, drink the water running out through his hat just ahead of his drinking. Ahead, the river narrowed and went into the swamp. The river became smooth and deep. The swamp looked solid with cedar trees, their trunks close together. So you don't want to fish in that kind of tangly mess, right? That must be why the animals that lived in the swamps were built that way. So there's another nod of Darwinism there, the way that the animals are made. Nick is thinking. Uh, and then this paragraph, Nick did not want to go in there now, the swamp. He felt a reaction against deep wading, with the water deepening up under his armpits to hook big trout into places impossible to land them. He felt a reaction. I think that's an interesting word. Why a reaction? Is it because of some previous history with deep water? And so I'm reminded, I don't know, of Forrest Gump in Vietnam, although I don't know if these things are similar, but the kind of deep wading that would have been done in fighting in Vietnam. In the swamp, the banks were bare. The big cedars came together overhead. The sun did not come through except in patches. It's vast and deep water and half light. The fishing would be tragic. That's right. So this word tragic, it's not that the fishing would be bad or the fishing would be difficult. The fishing would be tragic, is the word. In the swamp, fishing was tragic adventure. Nick did not want it. He did not want to go down the stream any further today. This kind of tragicness. And then at the end of the story, right, he washed the trout in the stream. When he held them back up in the water, they look like live fish. So why are we bringing them back to life? Kind of is the weird. It's a weird thing there. Their color was not gone yet. And then to end the story, right, there were plenty of days coming when he could fish the swamp. So, oops. I wonder if the swamp is war, if the swamp is the reaction to previous experiences in war. Does the swamp symbolize a kind of coming of war? There were plenty of days coming when he could fish the swamp, like he'd want to or like he would have to. I don't know. All right, John Steinbeck. Steinbeck's accomplishments has been called uneven, but his least is alive with human interest, and his best work seems to have the durability of the classic. He's the one with Grapes of Wrath, superb storyteller, California regionalist. So we're in California in our story, The Chrysanthemums, the coast and the hill country around Monterey Harbor. So he's writing about these kinds of things. The Dust Bowl also features as a relevant and interesting part of his story, agriculture and the way that people reacted to issues like the Dust Bowl and so on. And now, on with the Chrysanthemums. It's a very simple story, much like the one we just talked about, Big Two-Hearted River. Actually, it's not a lot like it at all. I don't know why I said that. It's just not very complicated. We have Henry and Eliza, Henry Allen and Eliza, and Henry, in the beginning of the story, is off selling cattle, and Eliza's over tending near the barn her chrysanthemums, her flowers. And a tinker comes along and flatters Eliza a little bit, cons her a little bit into giving him a pot, a flower pot, and giving some work to do, mending a pot or whatever. And Elisa's a bit seduced by the thought of romance with this tinker. The tinker, it comes up on this wagon. In any case, Elisa at the end of the story is disappointed to see that the man has dumped out her flower pot with a chrysanthemum in it simply because he wanted the pot. He could sell it. He lied to her, saying that he knew a woman up the road that would like to have a chrysanthemum. So that's kind of the story. Henry's up selling cattle. Uh, let's see here. Elisa, the story has a lot to do with feminism uh, and relationships between men and women and whose role is what and so on and so forth. So Eliza Allen, we start there, working in her flower garden, looked down across the yard and saw Henry, her husband, talking to businessmen. The three of them stood at the tractor shed, each man with one foot at the side, little Ford Sun. They side of the little Ford Sun. I guess that's a truck, right? They smoked cigarettes and studied the machine as they talked. Eliza watched them for a moment and then went back to her work. She was 35. Her face was lean and strong, and her eyes were as clear as water. Her figure, looked blocked and heavy in her gardening costume. So she's kind of wearing a costume. It's like work clothes. I wonder if costume there is an operative word, meaning having something to do with like what's false, right? They put on costumes that are fake. A man's black hat pulled low down over her eyes, clodhopper shoes, figured print dress, almost completely covered by a big corduroy apron. So her outfit is not very flattering, but not that it has to be. So it's maybe interesting that it's described in this way. The seeds and the knife she worked with. She wore heavy leather gloves to protect her hands while she worked. She was cutting down the old year's chrysanthemum stalks with a pair of short, powerful scissors. Powerful is also interesting. Later in the story, she feels powerful, right? Her face was eager and mature and handsome. Even her work with the scissors was overeager, over powerful. So her work is described in this kind of way. Uh, and where is it? Henry comes up after selling these cattle. He says, at it again. He said, you've got a strong new crop coming. Eliza straightened her back and pulled the gardening glove again. Said, yes, they'll be strong this coming year. And her tone and her face there was a little smugness. You've got a gift with things, Henry observed. So he's complimenting her, old Henry, her husband. Some of those yellow chrysanthemums you had this year were 10 inches across. I wish you'd work out in the orchard and raise some apples that big. So when he says this, does it ring of something like productive? Because flowers are ornamental. They're not a business like what he's done. What he's done is he sold cattle. But what she does with her chrysanthemums is not a kind of agricultural product. In fact, it's more of just this ornamental, decorative kind of product. And so when he says, I wish you'd work out in the orchard and raise some apples that big, he's making kind of passive aggressive comment, even though he's being very complimentary. She reads it, of course, like we all read it, this kind of passive aggressive way. Her eyes sharpened, right? Maybe I could do it too. I have a gift with things, all right. My mother had it. She could stick anything in the ground and make it grow. She said it was planter's hands. So this is what she claims to have, planter's hands. Well, it sure works with flowers. Henry, who are those men? And they're from the Western Meat Company, and he sold some cattle to them. Good I sold his 30 head of 3-year-old steers, got nearly my own price too. Good, she said. Good for you. So I wonder if the repetition there of good for you is also part of this tension in their relationship about productivity and who does what kind of work and so on. Um, and so this conversation leads to this one, or this is the end of that conversation. And I thought, he continued, I thought how it's Saturday afternoon and we might go to Selena's for dinner at a restaurant to celebrate, and then the picture show. Good, she repeated. Oh, yes, that would be good. Henry put on his joking tone. There's fights tonight. How'd you like to go to a fight? To the fights. Joking, right? Because he anticipates that she wouldn't want to go. And later we see that that's more complicated. Oh, no, she said breathlessly. Oh, my. Oh, heavens. No, I wouldn't like fights because she's a woman, right? She's not supposed to, and he's all joking. So they're back into this kind of relationship, back in balance with the relationship. Um, and so, when is this? Eliza, squatting on the ground, watched to see the crazy, loose jointed wagon pass by. So, this is when the tinker is pulling up. The tinker is a guy with these mismatched pair, which a donkey and let's see here. So we have this mismatched pair of a donkey and a mule, I guess, or a horse or whatever it is. And this mismatched pair might have something to do with the mismatch, if you will, of Henry and Eliza, their mismatching of a marriage. But anyway, this team, the donkey and the mule or whatever it is pulling the tinker's wagon. This tinker has this. He's like a handyman who goes around looking for work at different places, and she's watching him pass by. It turned onto the farm road in front of their house, crooked on old wheels, and so it comes down. Um, the man on the wagon seat called out, "That's a bad dog in a fight." When he gets started, he has a dog. Eliza laughed. I see he is. How soon does he generally get started? The man caught up her and laughed, echoed heartily. Um, and so he's kind of buttering her up, trying to sell her something, right? He replied with some asperity. It might surprise you what them beasts can pull through, talking about his team. Um, when they get started, so she's making a little joke. She's sharp, cutting wit. Um, and so finally he gets around to business. He says, you know, is there anything I can sharpen for you? Any pots I can mend? Scissors is the worst thing, he explained. Most people just ruin scissors trying to sharpen them. And she says, no, my scissors are all sharp. All right, then, take a pot, he continued earnestly, a bent pot, or a pot with a hole. I can make it like new. No, she said shortly. I tell you, I have nothing like that for you to do. So she's very direct. No to the salesperson. No, I've got nothing for you to do. His face fell to exaggerated sadness. So he's like pretending to be sad, wanting her sympathy. That's not working though. His voice took a whining undertone. I had a thing to do today. Maybe I won't. Blah blah blah. And she's irritated. I'm sorry, she said irritably. I haven't anything for you to do. His eyes left her face and fell searching the ground. He's looking for something. He needs something to keep him there. They roamed about until they came to the chrysanthemum bed where she had been working. What's them plants, ma'am? The irritation and resistance melted from Eliza's face. She's heretofore just been So stern, so direct, so cold. And now he mentions the plants, chrysanthemums, and she just melts. Oh, those are chrysanthemums. Giant white and yellows. I raise them every year, bigger than anybody around here. Kind of a long stem flower. Looks like a quick puff of colored smoke, and she's delighted, right? That's it. What a nice way to describe them. They smell kind of nasty. Uh-oh, he's misstepped. She says, "It's a good bitter smell," she retorted. Not nasty at all. He changed his tone quickly. I like the smell myself, right? He said it smelled nasty, and now he said, "Oh, no, no, I like it. I like it." So he realizes now he's kind of hit on something that she's interested in, and so they sit and talk for a while, and finally, uh, they all of their conversation about the chrysanthemums comes to a climax of sorts. um, can't say I have, ma'am. Heard of planter's hands, she said, and then this is when she starts to describe it, and they've become like very close on this page until, well, I can only tell you what it feels like. It's she's describing planter's hands, and uh, their relationship kind of gets real close here. It's when you're picking off the buds you don't want. Everything goes right down into your fingertips. You watch, it's a very sensual kind of description here. At least I read it that way. I'm not sure if you do. Your fingers work, they do it themselves. You can feel how it is. They pick the buds, they never make a mistake. They're with the plant. Do you see your fingers in the plant? You can feel that right up your arm. They know. They never make a mistake. You can feel it. When you're like that, you can't do anything wrong. Do you see that? Can you understand that? She was kneeling. This is how we know this becomes such an intimate moment. She was kneeling on the ground, looking up at him. Her breast swelled passionately. And so he starts to realize what's kind of going on here, where she's nearly kind of aroused. The man's eyes narrowed. He looked away self consciously, like, right? Like, are we doing this? Like, what are you getting at with all this? Maybe I know, he says. Sometimes in the night, in the wagon there, what do you think he's thinking here, right? What do you think? What do you think he thinks she's talking about? Elisa's voice grew husky. She broke in on him. I've never lived as you do, but I know what you mean. When the night is dark, why, the stars are sharp pointed and they're quiet. Why, you rise up and up. Every pointed star gets driven into your body. It's like that. Hot and sharp and lovely. So now they've shifted the conversation from chrysanthemums to a kind of innuendo, a kind of fantasy where they're both considering a kind of encounter in his wagon or something of the like. Kneeling there, and this is when it starts to break down. Kneeling there, her hand went out toward his leg. She starts to touch him in the greasy black trousers. Her hand is going out. She's almost going to touch him. Her hesitant fingers almost touched the cloth. Then her hand dropped to the ground. She crouched low like a fawning dog. He said, "It's nice, just like you say, only when you don't have no dinner, it ain't." And so he shifts the conversation from the sexy innuendo stuff to the material about I'm still trying to get paid. And so uh, she stood up then very straight, and her face was ashamed. She's ashamed of the way she just behaved. She held the flower pot out to him and placed it gently in his arms. So now she, like, I don't know, feels bad about whatever it is and gives him something to do. And she tells her that somebody up the road needs a chrysanthemum. So she gives him a pot to give to her, and he mends the pot that she gave to him, and he heads up the road. And so she goes back to the barn, and Henry's done working. They're getting ready to go out to town to celebrate. And she asks Henry, "What do you? How do I look?" He says, "Nice." You think I look nice? What do you mean by nice? Henry blundered on. I don't know. I mean, you look different, strong and happy. I'm strong. Yes, strong. What do you mean strong? He looked bewildered. You're playing some kind of game. So this is they're being funny, right? They're being or she's actually maybe offended, but they're messing around. And so he says, "You look strong enough to break a calf on your knee, happy enough to eat it like a watermelon." Um, for a second, she lost her rigidity. She was kind of joking around, just giving him a hard time, right? Uh, but they still had this kind of playful relationship. She's feeling very, I forgot to mention about how she feels after that encounter with the tinker. She's feeling very strong, very sexy, but she needs Henry to kind of reinforce that, and he doesn't quite. And then on the way, she tried not to look as they passed it, but her eyes would not obey. She whispered to herself sadly, he might have thrown them off the road. So this is when she sees that the guy's dumped the flower pot out. Uh, and so she's crying a little bit, trying not to let Henry see. And then she decides she considers going to the fights, but uh, wine will be enough. It'll be enough if we can have wine. It will be plenty. She needs some kind of consolation, something to make her feel more manly or more accepted. And so, in the end of the story, that's what she needs. She turned up her coat collar so he could not see that she was crying weakly, like an old woman. And so, uh, this story has a lot to do with the way that women were treated, the way that women were expected to behave, and how she was ended up not even being allowed to act out in any other way. And also consider the relationship between Eliza and Henry. Do they have a good marriage, or do they have an unhealthy marriage? Uh, yeah, those are some things to consider. All right, see you guys later.